It's lovely to see you here this evening, although actually I can only see a certain percentage of you from this spot here. It's always a bit of a relief sometimes when you get to the end of a talk like this and the lights come up and people are still here. So anyway, it's very nice to be here this evening. And I want to start with an easy question, if this came your way in a pub quiz or something like that. What is celebrated at the Christian festival of Christmas? There is an obvious answer, which is it is the birth of Jesus. And I guess nearly all of us would have put up our hands and agreed with that. And of course, that's right. And we've heard the readings from the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus' life about his birth. A whole dating system is based around it. But there is more to say. In fact, there is much more to say. The real reason, the deepest reason for celebrating Christmas goes beyond Jesus' birth. Interestingly, 2 out of the 4 Gospels, which give the accounts of Jesus' life, don't cover his birth at all. There is more going on. It's something truly momentous, and it's to be found in the passage which Sarah read to us just before we sang that carol. John chapter 1 and verse 14 says this: "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." The part of John's Gospel which Sarah read is often read at carol services. With its magnificent language, it fits the occasion. It's actually written by the man who wrote John's Gospel, who was an eyewitness of Jesus Christ, as a kind of blurb for his gospel. These first few verses, he's introducing what he's going to explain in the rest of his account, and he's wanting the reader to see what important things he's going to be sharing. And he brings before us a mysterious person he calls the Word. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." So here is this person who is with God and is God's. But then verse 14, the Word, this person, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Well, it's a plot spoiler, but John is referring to Jesus of Nazareth. We'll come back shortly to why he calls him the Words. And what John is saying is that Jesus was with God in the beginning. He is God. Through him all things were made. Yet he became flesh. He became a human being. He became one of us and lived among us. That's the really big message of Christmas. And the word that sums it up is the word incarnation. And that comes from the Latin word for flesh, rather like the word carnivore does. Jesus took on our human flesh. That's why his birth was no ordinary birth. And that's the theme of celebration that is reflected in the carols. He came down to earth from heaven, who is God and Lord of all. We sang once in Royal David City. But listen, it gets better than that. If that's all we had, it might just sound like a royal visit, coming to visit at one of the shops or colleges in town. But get the line from another carol we sang. "Lo, within a manger lies he who built the starry skies." God the Son came down from all eternity, from heaven into our world, to be born as a baby that Christmas, to take on human flesh. God with skin on, as it's sometimes been put. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. Hail the incarnate deity. He's not just a divine visitor, but the Son of God, fully God himself, becoming one of us. If you'd been around at the time, you'd have seen God the Son walking. You might have had a meal with him. You could have met him. You could have been out on a fishing boat with him. And we say to ourselves when we hear that, how can this possibly be? No wonder C.S. Lewis, the famous writer, called the incarnation the grand miracle, the biggest miracle of them all. And I remember vividly a time when I was visiting the region around Galilee, and I was in a hotel bedroom, looking out over the balcony across the Sea of Galilee, and the full moon was there in the sky. And I had a moment when I just thought to myself, how can it be that the person who made the moon also walked these shores historically 2,000 years ago? It is a momentous claim for John to make. There is nothing like it in any of the other religions of the world. So it automatically, or should raise the question, what on earth was it that made John think this? And we need to remember that the literature we call the Gospels, these 4 accounts of Jesus' life, were not written by people who'd grown up in a Christian home. They were not written by people who were brought up, in a sense, being taught these truths and accepting them. They were all written by people who'd started off not believing in Jesus, but having their minds changed by what they encountered. And so they're in a good position to tell us what it was that changed their minds, what it was that made them think this. And in John's case, if you look back to that verse, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. John gives us his grounds for thinking this. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. One of the biggest selling types of book is the memoir, which takes us into somewhere like the Cabinet Office or Buckingham Palace or something like that. I think it's one of the biggest selling books this year. I haven't read Spare by Prince Harry, but I have read, and I see it's number 2 in the bestsellers list, Rory Stewart's book, Politics from the Edge, where he shares his experience of what it's like to be in the cabinet room, what it's like to run a government department, that kind of thing, what it's like to meet various different prime ministers, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's a fascinating read because he was in the room. And John is saying, I was in the room. I was there with Jesus. He was there when Jesus turned the water into wine. He was there when Jesus healed a man who'd been paralyzed for 38 years. Or fed 5,000 people with a few loaves and fishes. He was there when Jesus gave sight to a man who'd never, ever been able to see. He was there when Jesus walked to the tomb of a dead friend, Lazarus, and said, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out and was soon eating a meal with the others. It's a very interesting thing that I think people who've not read these Gospels sometimes think they're just fairy stories. But if you read John's Gospel, you'll find that there are words which come up again and again and again, which give us a much better clue to what he's up to. They're the words witness, evidence, testimony, and verdict. Take a highlighter and you can find them many times in the Gospel. And those are the language, not of fairy stories, but of the courtroom. He's setting out evidence for what it was that persuaded him that God the Son had actually come into the world for those 30 or so years at the beginning of the present era. He did these extraordinary miracles, things that only God, the Creator, could do. And as you read the account, you'll see that John doesn't leave them just in the category of the weird and unexplained, but he shows how they fit a pattern from centuries before. 2 of the readings we had today were from hundreds of years before Jesus actually came, locating God's promised Saviour to be born in Bethlehem and to have a ministry in the area of Galilee. And that's just a small sample of much more that there is, which sets the pattern that Jesus perfectly fit. Now, I want to do a little advertising slot here. And to say that we have a pile of copies of John's Gospel in a good modern translation, very accurate modern translation. It's the same as the one in the large Bibles in the chairs. And you're most welcome to take one of these away. And my aim this evening is to encourage you this Christmas to read that Gospel for yourself, to come face to face with the evidence. Even if you read it many times before, you'll see Jesus up close and personal. The other little booklet that we have on all the chairs has got, in the beginning was the word written on it. This is a taster for something called the Word 1-to-1, which is an opportunity to read John's Gospel with a friend, to turn the reading of the Gospel from a private experience into a social event, preferably with a cup of coffee. And literally thousands of people across the UK and around the world have been using this over the last few years and found it to be an absolutely marvellous way to sort out the facts of the Christian faith, to sit there with a friend, perhaps look at it once a week or once a fortnight or something like that, and gently work your way through the gospel. This is the taster. The whole thing is available in a free app, which is explained in the booklet. I hope you may find that a great help. In my own experience, understanding the Christian claim that God had come into this world in the person of his Son that first Christmas was a game changer for me. I'd been an atheist as a teenager and then moved into a sort of period of agnosticism. And I remember many debates at home. Was there a God? Was there not a God? What was God like? And it felt like trying to nail a jelly to the wall. It just couldn't get anything to stick. We couldn't make any progress. And then when I came as a student to this university, I met some students who were believers in Jesus. And they said, why don't we meet and read through one of the Gospels, the historical accounts of Jesus' life? And all of a sudden, there was something to go on. Were these big claims true or not? Did they stand up to scrutiny or not? What was the nature of Jesus' mission in the world? Who exactly is he? And so on. And that was a life-changing thing for me. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And that means that God has made himself known to us. He may be known. We have quite a few squirrels in the garden at the vicarage, and they come and they go, possibly slightly too many of them. We have to keep the bird food away from them. Now, what if I really wanted to have a conversation with those squirrels and say, keep away from the bird food and keep away from the chicken coop and all this kind of thing? I don't know how exactly I could do that, but the best way I could communicate with squirrels and start a relationship would be if I was somehow, strangely, able to become a squirrel and do squirrel things with them, run around the trees and chat to them, go back to the squirrel nest and that kind of thing. Now, you'll forgive a rather trite illustration. I'm very different from a squirrel. Amazingly, though, God made us to be in his image. So for him to come into our world as one of us is not entirely foreign to his nature. It's as if it had all been planned. And God comes into the world to make himself known to us. And that's the point that John is aiming at as he explains these great things. When we get to the end of the passage, you'll see verse 18. It starts by saying, no one has ever seen God. I love the honesty of this. This is the great problem of religion, isn't it? Despite all the stuff that goes with religion, temples and priests and clothing and festivals and rituals and pilgrimages and sacred buildings, he blows the whistle and says, but actually no one's ever seen God. That's a devastating point. And if that's all that there is to be said, then your guess is as good as mine about what God is actually like. But, the one and only Son, who's himself God and is in the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known by becoming one of us. And that is a huge claim which has massive consequences for us. Let me give just two as we close. An uncomfortable consequence of this is that it's a bit harder, if this is true, to be an agnostic. If no one has ever seen God, and that's all there was to be said, then we could all just be groping about in the dark. We don't quite know who's right, and it's probably sensible to hold our counsel and our judgment. And many of us find it comfortable to occupy a sort of spiritual version of Switzerland. We don't want to be an atheist over there. We don't want to be a believer over here. So we have this in-between place of agnosticism. But John's claim is that God has made himself known by becoming one of us. And that shrinks our Switzerland, because it's saying that it isn't just a question of your guess being as good as mine. It makes a claim that the living God has come to us and made himself known to us. And the very least we can do is to investigate that claim. And if we're not willing to investigate that claim, well, we're being prejudiced. Being prejudiced is being down on what you're not up on. We're already deciding to vote against God. And to remain agnostic in the face of this evidence would be more difficult. There's also a positive consequence, a very wonderful consequence, which is this. we can really come to know God, our own creator, for ourselves. It isn't just a question of a long and winding road of search, not quite knowing where we're going to end up. But actually, God has taken the guesswork out of it by becoming one of us. And we find him as we leaf through the pages of this extraordinary account to be both a public figure who speaks to thousands, but somebody who's got time for individuals. And a great range of individuals, from a very religious senior sort of clergy person to a woman with a background which made her deeply ashamed and who was about as far away from organized religion as you could imagine. He makes friends with both. He offers new life to both. We find a man who dares to take on the evil of his day, particularly religious corruption and evil. We find a man who stops to care for people. We find a man who weeps at the death of a friend. Here is God in our world. And incidentally, the truth of the incarnation has proved for 2,000 years to be a great encouragement to Christian believers as they know that Jesus knows what our experiences are like because he was one of us. But even more than that, we find that he opens up the way to God for us. We get towards the end of John's gospel and we find that his death on the cross, far from being a failure, was a gateway. It was the whole purpose of his coming, that we might have our sins forgiven and come to know the God who made us. Not just in a general sense, but in a deep down personal sense, and who rose again to give us new life. The new life, which is what makes his followers tick. So that's the really big deal about Christmas. It's not just the birth of Jesus, although that was a great and mighty and amazing event. But it's because in that, God the Son became one of us. He's made God known. He's opened up the way to God for us. And John and his friends were there to see it. And he's taken the trouble to write an account of what he saw and what it was that persuaded him that this isn't make-believe, but true. How about this Christmas reading John's Gospel afresh? Well, we're going to have a moment now while we enjoy a song. And this song is about the Magi, sometimes called the Three Kings, who came from a vast distance to seek and to find the promised King, Jesus, who is coming into the world. They came a great long way to find him. And as we hear that, think, well, we can make a little bit of an effort to find out about him ourselves.